At 0900 hours on October 11, 1943, for seconds into the climb, Colonel Neel Kearby sat in the cockpit of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, sweating through his flight suit. He was 5 miles above the jungles of New Guinea, a place where the air was so hot and humid it felt like breathing soup. Kearby was a fighter pilot's pilot, aggressive, sharp, and absolutely fearless. But at that moment he was also frustrated. He was gripping the control stick of a plane that weighed nearly 15,000 pounds. To put that in perspective, that was the weight of 3 pickup trucks welded together, and he was trying to chase a Japanese fighter that weighed less than a single minivan. Kearby watched the enemy aircraft through his gun sight. It was a Mitsubishi A6M Zero, a beautiful and deadly little kite. Fragile, built from lightweight aluminum that could practically be punched through with a screwdriver, but that lightness gave it a terrifying advantage. It seemed to defy gravity. The Japanese pilot saw Kearby approaching. He didn't turn or dive. Instead, he simply pulled back on the stick and climbed. The Zero pointed its nose toward the sun and shot upward like an elevator. Kearby shoved the throttle forward. The massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine roared, 2,000 horsepower screaming in front of him as it tried to drag the enormous American fighter upward. But physics is a brutal rule. The P-47 was heavy. It was built like a tank, not a gymnast. As Kearby tried to follow the Zero into the vertical climb, the aircraft began to shudder. The airspeed indicator fell rapidly, 200 miles per hour, 150, 120. The controls turned soft and sluggish. The heavy nose wanted to fall back toward the earth. Above him, the Zero kept climbing, shrinking into a tiny dot against the blue sky. The Japanese pilot probably knew exactly what would happen. The American fighter was a brick with wings. The Zero could simply float above it, wait for the heavy aircraft to stall and drop away, and then dive down behind it. Kearby had no choice. He broke off the climb, pushed the nose down, and built speed to escape, cursing the heavy metal machine he was flying. This was the reality for the United States Army Air Forces in the Pacific. They were flying the P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft the pilots called the Jug. Officially, it meant juggernaut, but unofficially it was because the plane looked like a giant milk jug. It was enormous. The cockpit was almost as comfortable as a recliner. It carried 8.50 caliber machine guns that could cut a house in half, and it could absorb punishment that would destroy most other fighters. Pilots told stories about limping home with entire cylinders blown off the engine or wings torn open by holes large enough to crawl through. The aircraft was incredibly tough, but in a dogfight it was clumsy. The joke started almost immediately after the P-47 arrived in the Pacific. Pilots compared it to the sleeker fighters they were used to flying, like the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk or the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Next to those machines, the Thunderbolt looked like a beer barrel with wings. Mechanics disliked it because it was huge. Pilots disliked it because it could not turn with a Zero. If you tried, the Japanese fighter would circle around you before you had even completed half your turn. But the worst problem was the climb rate. In aerial combat, altitude is like money in the bank. If you are higher than your opponent, you choose when to attack. You can dive down, fire, and climb back to safety. If you are lower, you are the target. The Zeros dominated altitude. They could climb toward 20,000 feet, while American fighters were still struggling below them. Japanese pilots even joked that the P-47 loved the ground so much it should be called a groundhog. Back at base in Port Moresby, the mood among the pilots was grim. Everyone knew the Thunderbolt had a powerful engine. The R-2800 Double Wasp was a monster capable of producing around 2,000 horsepower. In theory, that should have been enough power to throw the aircraft toward the stratosphere. But the real problem was not the engine. It was the propeller. The standard propeller installed on early P-47s was nicknamed the toothpick. It had narrow, tapered blades designed for high-altitude cruising above Europe, where the air was thin. That design worked well when escorting bombers high over Germany. But down in the thick, humid air of the Pacific, where most dogfights actually happened, it was nearly useless. It was like trying to paddle a canoe with a butter knife. The propeller spun rapidly, slicing through the air, but it could not grab enough of it to generate strong thrust. The engine screamed. Fuel burned rapidly, but the energy was mostly noise. Colonel Kearby knew this better than anyone. As commander of the 348 Fighter Group, he was tired of watching Zeros climb above his pilots. He was tired of seeing his men return to base with bullet holes in their tails because they could not climb away from danger. He filed reports. He argued with supply officers. He demanded a solution. Then one day a transport aircraft landed. Ground crews unloaded several long wooden crates marked Curtiss-Wright. Mechanics pried them open with crowbars and peeled back the oily paper wrapping. Inside was a propeller unlike anything they had seen before. The blades were enormous. Instead of narrowing to sharp points, the tips were wide and flat, flaring outward at the end. One mechanic lifted a blade and started laughing. The propeller looked ridiculous, like a giant canoe paddle, like something drawn by a child who did not quite know what airplanes looked like. The ground crews gathered around making jokes. They said the engineers must have been drunk. They joked that if they mounted that thing on the jug, the wind resistance would be so bad the plane might fly backward. "Hey, Colonel," one crew chief called out. "You planning to go fishing? Looks like we found your oars." Kearby walked over and studied the strange propeller carefully. He did not laugh. He knelt down and ran his hand across the aluminum blade. He was not an engineer, but he understood a simple rule. If you want to move something heavy, you need grip. A wide shovel digs better than a needle. Low gear gives a car more power climbing a hill. That was exactly what this propeller was. A low gear for the sky. The wide blades meant more metal struck the air at the fastest part of the rotation. Each spin would grab a huge mass of air and throw it backward, instead of slicing through the air politely like the narrow toothpick. This propeller would shove it. It was not elegant. It was brute force. Kearby stood up and looked at his Thunderbolt sitting on the steel mat runway. Then he turned to mechanics. "Take the old prop off," he ordered. The laughter stopped. The crew chief frowned. "Sir, you want to test this thing? It might shake the engine right off the mounts." Kearby didn't hesitate. "Bolt it on," he said. "I want it ready in an hour." The mechanics went to work, grumbling about engineers in air-conditioned offices designing canoe paddles while they sweated in the jungle. They lifted the massive 13-foot propeller onto the nose of the fighter. It looked absurdly large. The blades were so wide they almost seemed to touch the ground. The sleek nose of the aircraft suddenly looked blunt and awkward. The plane resembled a farm tractor more than a fighter. But Kearby climbed into the cockpit anyway. He strapped in, signaled the ground crew to clear the propeller, and pressed the starter switch. The engine turned over, coughed smoke in the exhaust, and then roared to life. The new propeller spun, appearing like a solid metal disc at idle. Kearby pushed the throttle forward to taxi. The plane lurched. Even on the ground, he could feel the difference immediately. The propeller bit into the air with brutal force. The aircraft surged forward like a trailer had suddenly been removed from behind it. He lined up on the runway. Brakes locked. Throttle pushed forward to full power. The sound was different now. The old propeller produced a high-pitched whine. This one produced a deep, heavy roar that sounded like the air itself was being beaten into submission. Trees behind the aircraft bent violently under the blast of prop wash. Kearby released the brakes. Normally, a fully loaded Thunderbolt required nearly the entire runway to take off. It would lumber along slowly before finally lifting into the air near the end. Not this time. The giant paddle-shaped propeller grabbed the humid air and hurled it backward. The acceleration slammed Kearby into his seat. The tail rose instantly, and the runway markers flashed past in a blur. The aircraft left the ground before it had even used half the strip. It did not float upward. It leaped. Kearby raised the landing gear and glanced at the altimeter. The needle was no longer creeping upward. It was spinning. Kearby started to grin behind his oxygen mask as the clouds stacked beneath his aircraft. The new canoe paddle propeller wasn't a joke anymore. It was a revelation. What had once felt like a heavy, clumsy bathtub suddenly behaved like a rocket ship. Leveling off at 20,000 feet, He looked down at the endless green jungle and the vast blue ocean, where Japanese pilots patrol with confidence in their nimble Zeros. They believed they owned the sky, especially the vertical fight. In their minds, the Americans were stuck flying slow, heavy machines. Kearby banked the plane. The wide propeller bit into the air, helping pull the nose around with authority. The entire airframe vibrated with raw power. It no longer felt like driving a dump truck. It felt like driving a muscle car. He keyed his radio. "This is Kearby. Tell the boys to open the rest of those crates. We're going hunting." The transformation of the 348 Fighter Group didn't happen in a quiet laboratory. It happened in the mud and blistering heat of Port Moresby. Once Colonel Kearby landed and confirmed that the new canoe paddle propeller was a game changer, the order went out to retrofit every aircraft in the squadron. Ground crews worked around the clock. The sleek, narrow propellers were stripped from the noses of the P-47s and tossed into scrap piles. In their place, the mechanics bolted on wide, heavy Curtiss electric paddle blades. To a casual observer, it looked like they were ruining the planes. The oversized propellers seemed clumsy, like giant boots on a ballerina. But the pilots weren't looking for beauty. They were looking for survival. They watched the mechanics tighten the bolts and wipe grease from their hands, hoping that this ugly piece of hardware would stop the Zeros from dancing on their graves. Kearby didn't just give them a new propeller. He gave them a new rule book. Inside the briefing tent, a canvas oven baking under the tropical sun, he stood before a chalkboard and drew a diagram. For 2 years, American pilots have been told one absolute rule: never try to climb with a Zero. It was suicide. The Zero was a kite. The P-47 was an anvil. If a pilot tried to go vertical, the Zero would simply loop over the top and drop 20-millimeter cannon shells into his cockpit while he stalled helplessly in the air. Kearby wiped the chalkboard clean. "That rule is dead," he told them. With the new paddle blade propeller, the P-47 wasn't relying only on engine power to climb. The massive blades were physically grabbing the air, pulling the aircraft upward like the teeth of a gear. Suddenly, the Jug could trade speed for altitude faster than anyone thought possible. "Stop fighting like boxers," Kearby said. "Start fighting like falcons. Don't turn. Dive, strike hard, and then use the propeller to rocket straight back into sun." The pilots were skeptical. Unlearning fear is harder than learning a new tactic. Too many of them had watched friends die chasing Japanese fighters into vertical climbs. But they trusted Kearby. They strapped into their refitted machines, taxied past the palm trees, and roared into the sky. The first real test came in October 1943, during a patrol near Wewak, a major Japanese air base on the northern coast of New Guinea. Kearby led 4 P-47s on what the military called a fighter sweep, essentially a mission to go out and find trouble. They cruised high above the jungle at 25,000 feet. The difference was obvious immediately. At this altitude, the Jug normally felt sluggish and unstable, like it was balancing on the edge of a knife. With the new propellers, it felt solid, responsive. Then they saw them, tiny specks against the green jungle below. Japanese fighters, Oscars and Zeros, escorting a formation of bombers. The enemy aircraft were flying comfortably 15,000 feet below, unaware that the fight was about to begin. When the Japanese pilots finally spotted the P-47s high above them, they assumed the usual routine. The Americans would dive, fire a few shots, and then keep diving to escape. They prepared to dodge the attack and chase the fleeing fighters. Kearby signaled to strike. External fuel tanks dropped away, tumbling through the sky as the 4 P-47s rolled into their dive. The Jug loved to dive. The airspeed needle swept past 300, 400, pushing toward 450 miles per hour. Wind roared across the canopy as the fighters screamed down toward the Japanese formation. The Zeros scattered instantly, breaking left and right. Kearby fired a burst but missed, flashing past the formation. Now came the moment of truth. Normally, this was where the American pilot had to keep diving to survive. If he tried to climb, gravity and drag would slow the heavy aircraft, and the Zeros would swarm him. But Kearby didn't run. He yanked the stick back. The P-47 groaned under the brutal G-forces as the wings flexed. Then the paddle blade, propeller, did its work. The nose pointed straight up. The massive blades clawed at the air, and the aircraft shot skyward like it was being hauled upward by an invisible cable. The Japanese pilot stared in disbelief as the massive American fighters zoomed vertically past them. Two Zeros instinctively pulled up to follow. They believed they had the advantage. They expected the heavy P-47 to run out of energy within seconds. Instead, the opposite happened. The P-47 kept climbing. The lighter Zeros began to struggle. Their engines screamed, but their thin propellers couldn't grab enough air to keep climbing against gravity. Both fighters stalled. For a moment, they hung helplessly in the sky, noses wobbling as gravity won the fight. Kearby looked back and saw them frozen below him like fish in a barrel. He was now 2,000 feet above them. He kicked hard on the rudder and performed a hammerhead turn. The massive aircraft pivoted in the air, hung for a split second, and then plunged straight down along the path it had climbed. For a 7-ton fighter, it looked almost impossible, like watching a school bus perform an acrobatic flip. Kearby lined up the first stalled Zero in his sights. The Japanese pilot was trying desperately to regain speed, but he was practically parked in the sky. Kearby squeezed the trigger. 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted at once. Streams of heavy rounds smashed into Zero from above, ripping its wing off at the root. The aircraft didn't even catch fire. It simply disintegrated under the impact. Kearby shifted his aim to the second fighter. Tracers walked across the fuselage. The canopy shattered. The pilot collapsed, and the aircraft rolled over before plunging toward the jungle. The rest of the Japanese formation panicked. They had never seen a P-47 move like that. It completely defied everything they believed about the heavy American fighter. The formation broke apart as the remaining aircraft dove for the treetops, fleeing a battle they should have won. Kearby and his pilots returned to base with smoking gun barrels and nearly empty fuel tanks. Climbing out of their cockpits, they were soaked in sweat but grinning like schoolboys who had just pulled off the impossible. The ground crews ran toward the aircraft. No one joked about the canoe paddle propellers anymore. The mechanics patted the wide blades like they were prize hunting dogs. Word spread quickly across the Pacific. The jug wasn't a bathtub anymore. It was a rocket. Tactics changed almost overnight. The 348 Fighter Group began hunting from above, diving on enemy formations, blasting through them, then climbing straight back into the sky before repeating the attack. The method became known as boom and zoom, and with the new propeller it was devastating. Japanese intelligence was baffled. Reports claimed the Americans had introduced an entirely new fighter aircraft. They couldn't believe the bulky P-47 was capable of such maneuvers. But they didn't realize the truth. It wasn't just Kirby's plane. It was every plane. Soon the Japanese command moved their best units into the Wewak area to counter the threat. Among them was a new fighter, the Ki-61 Tony. Unlike the fragile Zero, the Tony was designed to fight American aircraft. It had armor, a liquid-cooled engine, and the speed to dive with the heavy P-47. The Japanese believed this new fighter would finally be the answer. Kearby welcomed the challenge. He wanted to prove that the paddle blade propeller wasn't just a gimmick for killing Zeros. He wanted to see how it performed in a real fight. On March 5, 1944, the stakes rose dramatically. Kearby led a massive fighter sweep over Wewak. This time he wasn't looking for a small skirmish. He intended to break the back of Japanese air power in New Guinea. Flying tight on his wing were Major Samuel Blair and Captain William Dunham. Soon they spotted a formation of 15 Japanese aircraft. But as they dove to attack, something felt wrong. Below the first group, hidden against the dark green jungle canopy, another layer of fighters waited. And above them, circling near the sun, was a third layer. It was a trap, a carefully arranged 3-layer ambush designed to lure the Americans in and crush them from every direction. Nearly 40 Japanese fighters were waiting. Kearby saw the danger immediately. A cautious commander would have pulled away and used his speed to escape, but Kearby was riding the adrenaline of his new machine. In his mind, the power of the paddle blade could drag him out of any fight. He didn't turn away. Instead, He keyed his microphone. Engaging. Then he dove straight into the hornet's nest. He slashed through the first layer of fighters with his guns blazing. One key, 61 Tony, exploded directly in front of him. Kearby pulled back on the stick, expecting the familiar rocket climb that had saved him so many times before, but this time the sky was full of bullets. The Japanese had learned. Instead of chasing him upward, they had positioned fighters above the battlefield, waiting specifically for the American zoom climb. As Kearby rocketed upward, 3 enemy fighters dropped from above to intercept him. He was caught in a vertical pincer. Enemies below and enemies above. The paddle blade propeller clawed desperately at the air, dragging the heavy fighter upward, but this time the odds were closing in. Kearby glanced at his fuel gauge as tracers streaked past his canopy. For the first time since installing the new propeller, the engine's roar didn't sound like victory. It sounded like a warning. The sky over Wewak turned into a blender. 3 Tony fighters screamed down toward him at 400 miles per hour, their cannons flashing. Below him, the rest of the Japanese formation climbed to block his escape. He was the meat in the sandwich. In most aircraft, this would have been the moment of bailout. But Kearby wasn't flying a Mustang. He was flying the Jug, and he had the paddle blade. He slammed the throttle forward past the safety stop, and engaged war emergency power. Inside the massive Pratt and Whitney double wasp engine, a mixture of water and alcohol sprayed into the cylinders like liquid adrenaline. The cooling effect allowed the engine to burn fuel harder, without destroying itself. Horsepower jumped instantly. Exhaust pipes spat blue flames. The propeller, already spinning at maximum speed, bit violently into the air, and the engine's roar sharpened into a scream. The P-47 didn't just climb, it clawed its way upward. The 3 Japanese pilots expected an easy kill. They lined up the heavy American fighter in their gun sights. But then the impossible happened. Instead of slowing down as it climbed, the P-47 accelerated. It surged upward like a missile leaving its silo. Kearby pointed the nose into a steep climb and aimed directly at the lead attacker. It became a game of chicken at a combined closing speed of nearly 700 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot blinked first. At the last second, he jerked his aircraft to the right to avoid a collision. That was his mistake. Kearby slammed the rudder, and the wide paddle blades twisted the heavy fighter around with shocking authority. The nose of the Jug swung onto the belly of the turning enemy plane. Kearby held the trigger down. 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted together, and the stream of tracers tore straight into the Tony's fuel tank. The fighter didn't just catch fire, it vaporized. A violent fireball of orange flame and shredded aluminum filled the sky as Kearby flew straight through the explosion. When he cleared the smoke, he was suddenly above the first wave of fighters. He leveled out for a moment and looked down. His wingmen, Blair and Dunham, were fighting desperately below, surrounded by a swarm of Zeros. Kearby could have kept climbing and escaped, but he saw a Zero locking onto Blair's tail. The Japanese pilot was skilled, patiently waiting for the American to stall. Kearby rolled his P-47 upside down and pushed the nose down. Gravity became his ally. The massive fighter dropped like a meteor as the propeller blades stabilized a dive. The Japanese pilot never saw him coming. Kearby lined up carefully and fired a short burst. Just a quick 1-second tap. That was enough. The concentrated storm of bullets smashed into the Zero's engine. The propeller tore loose and spun away. The cowling shredded instantly, and the aircraft flipped into a flat spin, drifting toward the jungle like a dead leaf. 2 kills. By now the battle had turned into complete chaos. The Japanese formation lost its discipline, and pilots swarmed toward the single silver P-47 that seemed to ignore gravity and numbers alike. This was where the Jug earned its reputation as a flying tank. As Kearby climbed again, a 20mm shell slammed into his right wing. In a Zero that hit would have ripped the wing off completely. In the P-47, it simply punched a hole the size of a dinner plate. Another round struck the armored plate behind his seat with a clang like a hammer hitting a church bell. The armor held. The aircraft shuddered, absorbed the punishment, and kept flying. Kearby ignored the damage and pulled the stick back again. The paddle blades grabbed the air, and the Jug shot upward once more. Several Zeros tried to follow, but they burned their energy in tight turns while Kearby relied on raw vertical power. Soon the thinner air at 20,000 feet punished them. One Zero stalled and hung motionless in the sky. Kearby cut the throttle, kicked the rudder, and flipped the heavy fighter over the top in a hammerhead turn. Now he was diving straight down on the stalled aircraft. Kearby waited until the enemy filled his windscreen and fired. The Zero shattered into fragments, so small they glittered in the sunlight. 3 kills. The fight had lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Kearby's arms ached from wrestling the controls, and his flight suit was soaked in sweat, but he wasn't finished. In the distance, he spotted a group of Tony fighters trying to reform their formation. They stayed level, hoping to lure him into a turning fight. With a heavier P-47 would struggle. Kearby checked his ammunition. He still had plenty. The Jug carried nearly 4,000 rounds, enough to fight a small war. He signaled his wingman. "Form up. We're going back in." They climbed again, hiding in the glare of the sun. Kearby selected the leader of the Japanese formation and pushed into another dive. The wind screamed across the gun ports, and the vibration shook the instrument panel. So violently the dials blurred. The Japanese leader saw him coming and broke left. Kearby didn't follow the turn. Instead, he aimed ahead at the empty space where the enemy aircraft was about to be and fired a wall of lead. The Japanese fighter flew straight into it. The wing root tore apart instantly, and the aircraft snapped violently, tumbling end over end through the sky. For kills. But as Kearby pulled out of the dive, another Japanese fighter flashed across his nose, attempting a deflection shot. Kearby reacted instantly. He yanked the stick back and turned inside the enemy. The P-47 shouldn't have been able to do it. It was simply too heavy, but the massive airflow from the paddle blades kept the wings alive even on the edge of a high-speed stall. The aircraft shuddered violently, but held the turn. For a fraction of a second, the enemy plane crossed his gun sight. Kearby squeezed the trigger, and a stream of bullets stitched along the fuselage from tail to nose. The cockpit canopy shattered. The pilot slumped forward. The plane rolled inverted and plunged into the ocean. 5 kills. He had tied the record, but the sky was still full of targets. His wingmen were shouting about bandits everywhere. The Zooies were fighting a battle that should have been suicidal. 3 Americans against nearly 40 Japanese fighters. But the psychology of the fight had flipped. The Japanese pilots were terrified. They were fighting ghosts that could vanish upward whenever danger appeared. The bathtub had become the shark. Kearby spotted a straggler, a Zero trying to escape toward the Wewak airstrip. The pilot hugged the treetops, believing the heavy American fighter wouldn't follow him down into the thick air. Kearby rolled over and dove. He chased the Zero all the way to deck level. The jungle canopy flashed beneath them at 400 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot zigzagged wildly, banking around towering trees and fighting for his life with every ounce of the Zero's agility. Kearby couldn't match those tight turns, but he didn't need to. He used the boom and zoom tactic in reverse, staying slightly higher, cutting the corners, and letting his speed close the distance. He waited patiently for the moment when the fleeing pilot had to straighten out to cross a ridge. That was the window. Kearby squeezed the trigger and fired a long burst. Tracers ripped through the air, setting trees ablaze behind the Zero. Then the bullets found their mark. The Zero's fuel tank detonated. A fireball rolled across the jungle, leaving a black scar in the green landscape. 6 kills. In a single mission, Colonel Neel Kearby and his paddle-bladed Jug had destroyed 6 enemy fighters. It was a feat that defied every statistic in the book. He glanced at his fuel gauge. The needles were bouncing on empty. His ammunition counters were nearly dry. "Let's go home, boys," he rasped over the radio. The 3 P-47s turned south and climbed back to 20,000 feet, leaving the smoking wreckage of the Japanese formation behind them. No one followed. The surviving Japanese pilots were too busy trying to understand what had just happened. Their best aircraft and most experienced pilots had been shredded by 3 heavy American fighters that moved like rockets. As they flew back toward New Guinea, the adrenaline slowly drained away, replaced by the deep exhaustion of combat. Kearby looked out toward his wing and saw the jagged hole where the cannon shell had struck. The aluminum skin was torn and ripped. The aircraft looked battered, like something dragged from a scrapyard. Then he looked at the nose. The wide black disc of the propeller spun smoothly, pulling the damaged plane to the sky without a single vibration. It was the ugly stick that had saved his life. Kearby patted the dashboard. The jug was a beast, a massive lead sled, but with that canoe paddle mounted on the front, it ruled the sky. When he taxied Fiery Ginger onto the hardstand at the air base, the fighter looked like it had gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight boxer and lost. There were holes in the wings big enough to put a fist through. The fuselage was peppered with shrapnel scars, and oil streaked along the cowling from a ruptured line. Ground crews ran out to meet him. They had seen planes return in terrible condition before, but the pilots were usually pale, shaking, and half in shock. Kearby wasn't shaking. He climbed out of the cockpit grinning. Walking in front of the aircraft, he slapped the enormous propeller blade. It was untouched. The canoe paddle had dragged the shattered fighter all the way home. He turned to crew chief and said, "Paint 6 flags on the side and load more ammo." The report from that mission traveled up the chain of command faster than any radio signal. 6 confirmed kills in a single sortie, an extraordinary achievement. But the real importance wasn't the score. It was the method. Kearby explained in detail how the paddle blade propeller allowed the P-47 to fight vertically even while surrounded by dozens of enemy aircraft. The wide tips acted like shovels digging into the air, refusing to lose their grip even when the fighter was hanging on its tail. The debate ended immediately. The experts who had mocked the ugly propeller stopped laughing. Orders were issued to equip every P-47 in the Pacific with paddle blade propellers. Shiploads of the new blades arrived at island bases, and mechanics who once joked about them now worked double shifts installing them. The effect on the war was immediate. Japanese pilots who had relied on climbing away from American fighters suddenly discovered the sky was no longer safe. They would begin their familiar escape climb only to glance back and see a 7-ton American jug rocketing upward behind them, its massive propeller screaming through the air. The safe zone was gone. The P-47, once dismissed as a failure in dogfights, became the undisputed energy king of the Pacific. For Neel Kearby, however, the story didn't end peacefully. Pilots who fly the way he did, pushing the limits of physics and luck every day, rarely grow old in bed. He had proven his point. He had changed the tactics. He could have taken a desk job, toured the country selling war bonds, or enjoyed the fame of his record. Instead, he kept flying. He kept hunting. Only a few months after that famous mission, Kearby again led a flight over Wewak while pursuing a Japanese bomber. In the heat of the chase, he made a mistake he would have scolded his own students for. He became fixated on the target. Focused entirely on the kill, he forgot to check his 6. A Japanese fighter slipped into his blind spot. A burst of machine gun fire tore into the cockpit. Fiery Ginger rolled over and plunged straight into the jungle. The wreckage was discovered years later. Colonel Neel Kearby was credited with 22 aerial victories and awarded the Medal of Honor. He became one of the deadliest fighter pilots in American history. Yet his true legacy wasn't the score, it was the propeller. Because of that innovation, the P-47 Thunderbolt finished the war not as a joke, but as a legend. In Europe, the paddle-bladed jugs became the hammer of the Army Air Forces. The same raw power that allowed the fighter to climb also allowed it to carry enormous loads of bombs and rockets. The P-47 became a flying freight train, diving on German tanks, trains, and bunkers, unleashing destruction, and then clawing its way back through flak-filled skies. The aircraft's toughness became legendary. Photographs show P-47s returning to base with half a wing missing, cylinders blown from the engine, and control cables severed, yet still flying home. One pilot famously flew home after clipping a brick chimney with his wing. The airplane didn't care. It was built like a cast-iron stove. As long as that wide propeller was turning, the jug kept flying. Japanese and German pilots never fully understood it. Their aircraft were elegant machines, like samurai swords or fine watches, beautiful and precise but fragile. If you damaged a key part, the whole system failed. The American fighter was different. It was a sledgehammer, ugly, heavy, and brutally simple. But a sledgehammer keeps working no matter how many times you hit it. The paddle blade propeller proved a lesson engineers sometimes forget, the best solution isn't always the most aerodynamic one. Sometimes you just need grip. You need traction. You need to grab the air by the throat and force it to do what you want. After the war, most of the P-47s were scrapped. Their aluminum was melted down to make house siding or soda cans. The jet age arrived, and propeller fighters, fat blades or thin ones, became relics of another era. The sleek P-51 Mustang captured most of the attention in movies and popular history because it looked beautiful and fast even while sitting still. The P-47 looked like a potato with wings, so it slowly faded from public memory. But if you walk into an aviation museum today and find the P-47 display, don't look first at the guns or the cockpit. Look at the nose. Look at the propeller. If you see thin, needle-like blades, you're looking at the early factory version, the one that nearly got its pilots killed. But if the propeller has wide, paddle-shaped blades that flare at the tips, you're looking at the version that changed everything. You're looking at the canoe paddle. It looks ridiculous. It looks like it doesn't belong on a fighter plane. It almost looks like a mistake. But imagine the sound of 2,000 horsepower spinning those massive blades. Imagine the air screaming as it's beaten into submission. Picture a 15,000-pound metal machine climbing straight into the vertical, hanging in the sky on nothing but a bite of those ugly blades while enemy fighters stall and fall away beneath it. Stories like this are worth remembering so that pilots like Colonel Neel Kearby don't disappear into silence. It's easy to look at an old black and white photo of a clunky airplane and laugh, just like the mechanics did in 1943. We judge machines by how they look instead of how they work. We forget that sometimes the difference between a death trap and a miracle can be just a few extra inches of metal welded onto the tip of the propeller. It takes a rare kind of courage to look at a supposedly perfect design, call it wrong, and bolt something as crude as a canoe paddle onto the nose of your aircraft because you know it will keep you alive. Neel Kearby didn't just fight enemy pilots. He fought the status quo. He fought the idea that good enough was acceptable. Because he won that fight, thousands of American pilots made it home to their families instead of ending up as smoking wrecks in the jungle. So the next time you see a P-47 Thunderbolt, give the big machine a respectful nod. It might be ugly. It might look like a bathtub with wings. But with the right propeller on the front, it could dance with the devil and win.